Yeah, the electric cars are definitely in our future. We're definitely going to have more electric cars, and we should. They're good for a number of reasons. They're good for the environment. They're good for the economy. They're good for people. And one of the problems we have in Australia, Barry, is just the vast distances. So what we need are charging stations, and that's one of the things that's holding us back now. There's also some government regulation, and we need some government incentives to have more electric cars. But once we get the charging stations in place, a bit of a chicken and egg situation. If we have enough cars for charging stations, then they'll build more charging stations, and the other way around. The more charging stations we have, the more electric cars we have. But it's definitely in our future.
So what's the difference then? It's just that remoteness, is it? Because if you go to Europe, you would see quite a different story.
That's right. And part of it is just a perception that if I'm going to drive from Perth to Albany, am I going to get stuck in the middle of the road without a charging station because I haven't charged up my car? And some of it's true, and some of it's just a perception, a bit of a fear and a concern that people have.
What needs to tip it? What would tip it?
Well, I reckon if we have, and without getting too political about it, if we have a big
government
push,
incentive, you know.
Yeah, I reckon a big government incentive would push more charging stations, and then we'd have more people adopting them.
What about self-driving cars? Where are we at?
We could talk for hours about that. But self-driving cars, I think, is fantastic technology. Yeah. The technology is already better than human drivers. But we've got so many cars on the road, and the big shift is going to happen when enough people go, we're happy with self-driving cars and we're happy to be driven around. And what we really want is that all the cars on the road are going to be self-driving. So you won't be allowed to drive a car anymore. But you know what? People love their cars. And so that's going to take some time to happen. The technology is all there. We're not ready for it.
What would need to happen for us to be ready for it?
Well, so what's happening at the moment is self-driving cars are going to be on the roads with us, with human drivers as well. And that's actually a tougher problem to solve. It's easier if all the cars are self-driving and you don't have idiot drivers on the road. But that's not going to happen immediately. So what's going to happen first is we're going to see these companies coming in with self-driving cars. They're going to be shown to be reasonably safe, and then people are going to gradually get comfortable with the idea that they're going to be driven around in a self-driving car. It's probably going to happen first with self-driving like Ubers and taxis. So you might get a ride in a car with which is driving itself, and initially there'll be a driver there, like a safety driver, who's there to take over and press a big red button if something goes wrong. But eventually we'll get comfortable with that.
Where are we seeing it at the moment? I suppose in the mining industry, are we?
That's definitely happening. So it's definitely happening where we're seeing a lot of self-driving vehicles there. But it's a very controlled environment there, Barry. So it's still remote, and there's some challenges, but you can control it. You can look after the environment that the car's in, which you can't do when you're traveling on a suburban road and there are kids and dogs and other drivers around, and that's what people are worried about.
My guest this morning on ABC Radio Perth and WA, Gihan Pereira. He's a futurist. We're looking at the future of transport. To tell me, what's a volocopter?
Now there's a volocopter is a self-driving, so it's a flying taxi. So this is
like Jetsons.
This is the Jetsons.
Yeah.
This is the Jetsons, like after more than half a century.
Or Blade Runner.
We got the Jetsons. So this is a flying taxi, and the idea is like a little mini helicopter, but it's basically a flying drone, but it's a drone that's big enough to take one or two passengers. And so this is kind of the idea of the future is that not that everyone will be driving it, because you know what the roads are like now with people driving on the roads. You don't want everyone being able to fly around in taxis, but
No.
they're going to be kind of self-driving flying taxis. And there's a few companies around who are trialing this. Singapore is supposed to be doing this trial of it coming up in the next 12 to 18 months, where they're going to be trialing people being able to call up, like they call up an Uber, they call up one of these flying drones, and then it takes them from one place to another within the city of Singapore.
You mentioned at the start, when it comes to electric cars, there were some hiccups or some delays through a regulation or a lack of regulation. Now, that often is the case when it comes to technological advancement. We see that the law or the regulation doesn't necessarily keep up with what the technology is. So what sort of regulation would need to be introduced if we had what you've just described there?
Well, see, like CASA's on the front foot about this. So they're already looking at how do we regulate drones? How do we anticipate some of these changes to transport? And CASA, of course, cares about airspace. So they're looking at things like drones, and they're looking at things like drones with passengers in them as well. So so the government is actually looking at this, and they're not completely blind to the potential, but sometimes you need the technology to be in place first before you realize what regulation you need. So it's like both parties have to come to it. Yeah, it really is figuring out how to make it work effectively.
It's like what the advancements we've seen with the internet, over the last 20 years, and the way that the law hasn't necessarily kept up.
Yeah, exactly.
With it,
like we didn't realize how much data we're giving away to big companies like social media companies, and now we're starting to push back and go, you know what, our privacy matters. But it's very hard to anticipate that up front before we started using the technology.
The next thing, the Hyperloop, sounds an interesting concept. This is an underground tunnel.
So this is one of Elon Musk's less crazy ideas, I think. So he has this idea of this underground tunnel. You get into a thing which is like a pod, and because it's very low friction, you can travel very fast. And you travel between cities much faster than you can drive. And so the idea is that you have this. You get into a little pod,
it's like
and
Star
it pushes
Wars.
you through. Yeah, with very low friction, but through this tunnel. And there have been some studies done, particularly on the East Coast. If you could connect Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, that East Coast with this Hyperloop tunnel where you just have stops along the way and you can get off and get on, it just completely transforms the transport system.
How big is the pod? So we're talking about like a train, are we?
Oh, we're talking about like a railway carriage.
Yeah.
So something like a small railway carriage, you get in there or a big car and you get into the pod and it just shoots you through the tunnel.
The final one is flying through the air with jet engines strapped to your feet.
Yeah, jetpacks. So we've got jetpacks as well, Barry.
So this is what we saw at the '84 Olympics at Los Angeles. Was there a guy in a jetpack that went up into?
That's right.
Yeah, but this is slightly different.
And well, the technology's got a lot better since then, and there are people. So the technology is available, so you can fly around with this jetpack that you strap it yourself, and you control yourself as you're flying. So again, it's going to be a while before everyone's going to be flying around using jetpacks, but the technology's there.
The advantage in that? Just from A to B, is that what?
It's totally that. It's totally being able to transport yourself from A to B very fast, 150k. So it's pretty fast when you think about that. And just get around with a jetpack tied to you. Just
finally, what about the cultural shift that needs to happen? Because we're actually seeing a reintroduction or a reinvigoration of interest in slow travel. Yet this is the complete opposite, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's never either or. It's always the opportunity of and. So I remember traveling across the Nullarbor in the Indian Pacific when I was a uni student to go to Sydney, and I had 3 days to myself, and it was fantastic. It was a fantastic experience. Now I just think I don't have the luxury to do that, so I'd rather just fly in a few hours. But there's no reason why we can't have both, and it just gives us more options.
Gihan, thank you very much.
Thanks, Barry.
Food for thought.